There is a handout that you have. Don't be scared of the handout. There's a lot of stuff there. We're not going to go over everything, not at once. And when we do go over the material, if you studied with me before, you know I go through it carefully and as carefully as we need to. So if I'm going too quickly, just say so. And also for those who missed the first part of what I was saying online, all the classes are recorded. So if you miss one, we'll make sure to have it put up online. And if you don't want to show your face on the Zoom, you should turn off your camera, because I think with the recordings you can still see, right, Daniel? Sometimes you can see the faces of people, and that this will go online. Okay, an introduction to the material. Called this class Holy Place, Eternal or Ephemeral. What are we going to be talking about? If you think about it, the idea that there are some places in the world that are holier than others, which is something I think that we have ingrained within us and almost take for granted. Even with my kids, I tell them, no, we're in synagogue. You behave a certain way in synagogue. Contradicts the way we understand God to have created the world. The world in its creation, we just read this in synagogue a couple of weeks ago. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it doesn't say anything about one place being holy and another place not being holy. That is this idea that we have taken for granted, that there are places that are holier than others. Doesn't seem at the outset of the story to be so self-evident. But I think in almost every religion, there is an idea that there are certain places, often temples and sanctuaries, whose status, holy status, is independent of the people who are gathered there. And that's an important idea that I want to mention right from the beginning, because it's sort of fundamental to this conversation. There is the question of a holy place sanctified by the presence of people, right? In a time of an active service going on, for instance, in the synagogue, you have to behave a certain way, otherwise the service can't take place. Their service should be dignified in a particular way. But once everyone leaves, once people have left, why is a synagogue any holier than the hallway right outside of it? For instance, is it the fact that there's a Sefer Torah there? Is it the fact that when this synagogue was dedicated, some holy status was placed on that land or on that in that room? What other holy spaces can you think of in Judaism? In our religion, are there any places where there are traditions to act differently there? What comes to mind? The Wailing Wall, right? Which is a really interesting comment. What is the Wailing Wall? It's the Western Wall, but historically, and we stand outside of the wall, right? Remember, the temple was above the Temple Mount. So we act with a certain degree of reverence. If you've ever been there before, you see people will walk backwards, never turn around. For this wall built by King Herod, which was never used, the wall never had any purpose other than over the centuries being a gathering place, given that it was the closest you could come to where the Holy of Holies used to stand. So it's a very interesting comment, right? Yeah, we have this sense that it's a holy place, but there was never any ceremony that made it holy. History sanctified that place. What else? Someone mentioned Hebron, right? Along with Tiberias, and why am I forgetting the fourth city? Tiberias, Jerusalem, Hebron, and it could be Tzvat, are the four cities that have particularly holy status. There are, in Hebron, it's a bit obvious why. If you've ever been to Hebron, the central reason people go to Hebron is to see the cave of the patriarchs, the Me'arat HaMachpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is buried. So that brings up something very interesting. There is not only there a respect for history, but there's a certain amount of dignified behavior that we expect from people at cemeteries where people are buried. When you think about holy places in Judaism, not just the cave of the patriarchs, but when you go to certain cemeteries, particularly in Eastern Europe, you'll see sites of very holy men where they were buried, and those sites are still treated with a great deal of holiness, right? What else?
That covers the certain rabbis that people go to their grave because they understand that that's a...
They understand that in that place where someone is buried, you should behave differently. There are things we expect of you and things we expect you not to do when you visit the grave of somebody who was a tzaddik, for example, or a Rabbi, right?
They teach the children in Israel, and they teach school children to the cemeteries where
Yes.
And they teach them, the teacher teaches them, you must behave, and you must...
Right. Behavior at a cemetery, again, is a great example of a holy place. And maybe the most holy place of all is the Temple Mount, which you may have heard many Jews believe you are not even permitted to walk upon, right? Lest you accidentally step on a place where the Holy of Holies once stood. Who was allowed in the Holy of Holies? Only one guy, and only once a year. Who? The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was allowed there only. So if you're walking around and accidentally stumble upon that place, perhaps you are violating that rule, right? That only the high priest can be there. The Temple Mount and its holy status is in the subject of many controversies, both historically and today. No temple, in case you didn't get the memo, exists on that mountain. In fact, a Muslim shrine exists on top of the mountain. But if we imbue that site with an eternal holiness, doesn't it make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to compromise on perhaps ceding, at least in part, some of that land to another religion that also deems it to be holy? And one could make the same argument if I believe that the Temple Mount is eternally holy to Jews. I might make the same argument with regards to the land of Israel. Is all land that historically belonged to the borders of the kingdom of Judah or Israel, does that land have a holy status? We're reading this week, Parshat Lech Lecha. Remember, Lezaracha etenet haaretz hazot, the Torah says. This land belongs, God says to Abraham, to your descendants. is that an eternal sanctification of the land, which makes it a lot more difficult theologically to part with? Or is that assignment of the land conditional? And by the way, there are many sources, particularly in the book of Devarim, which say, no, God promised you that land, but God can change his mind if you don't behave properly. You don't behave properly, you'll go into exile and you will lose the land. The land might lose its status as holy for you. This is, in my mind, an interesting topic to explore in advance of the 75th anniversary of Israel. First of all, because it relates to why Israel is special to us, and I hope we're going to see some sources that help to add clarity to that question. Why is this land important to us? What are the biblical sources that point to Jerusalem specifically as being of holy status, uncompromisingly holy status to Jews eternally? And also because I feel like you're going to see as this class develops that this is just a great topic to understand the history of how Jewish law develops. And we're going to look, depending on how far we get this year, at some modern sources too. There are some who believe that we should be offering sacrifices on the Temple Mount now. Why should we stop? The Bible says this is the sacrifice you offer on this day, and we have the ability to offer sacrifice on that day, regardless of whether a temple is standing or not, then why not do it? There are some who believe we should already be building the temple. There are some who believe we should be offering sacrifices elsewhere. If we can't offer a sacrifice on the Temple Mount, well, the Kotel Plaza might be a good idea. Let's build an altar there and restore the sacrificial worship as close as we can get to where the temple once stood. And you'll actually see in the sources a difference in opinion about how to handle the temple's destruction and its holy status thereafter. Does that make sense to everybody? You can see how these questions would be very relevant to the rabbis who lived during the period of the destruction and in the centuries soon following the destruction. The only Judaism they knew was one centered on a place, a very specific place, a place that many of them could actually see, still see from wherever they lived in other parts of the Middle East. And yet they weren't sure what to make of that place now that no temple existed on it. And now that the normal rituals of Judaism, which were also centralized in the temple, now that they were interrupted. So we see some of that coming out of the text. Differences of opinion. Do we go back to that place? Are we meant to go back to that place? Are we meant to do something else until the temple is rebuilt? And is that place so holy that a believing Jew could never really compromise on letting it go? In 2000, when Ehud Barak was negotiating with the Palestinians on, remember it, Barak's plan was famously the best ever plan that Israel ever came up with. It returned almost all of the land to the Palestinians, the land of Judea and Samaria, and on land that would not be returned, there were swaps. But Barak who was no right-winger, in his rhetoric, called the Temple Mount Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. This man who was prepared to part with much could not envision ever having to compromise on Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Ultimately, that Temple Mount had to be in Jewish hands, almost like Israel would not mean anything if we didn't have sovereignty over that place. Now, he wasn't saying that because of any ritual or building that exists on the Temple Mount. He was saying, and as a secular Jew, that site historically is so holy for Jewish people. We could never part with it, and it is almost the foundation of our connection to the land of Israel in the first place, right? And that, I remember him saying that, and the rhetoric calling the Temple Mount Holy of Holies was used by those who did not approve of this agreement that Barak came up with, to show that Jews were not really prepared to compromise, even though that was nonsense, right? So labeling something as holy can have significant impacts, even on modern political arrangements, right? We live in a world with lots and lots of conflicts. And the truth is, some land is worth more than others. It's interesting, in the fight with Ukraine and Russia, there are some interesting parallels here. Why is it that Russia wants Ukraine back? It's because that land has some holy status for the Russian people. The origins, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that the origins of the Russian people go back to Ukraine. That's where the Rus people began, in cities like Kiev. So to be apart from your historical origins, that's the kind of rhetoric that leads to war, right? And that leads to uncompromising positions. So it almost behooves us to understand, as modern Jews, where does this idea come from? And is the status of the Temple Mount really so fundamental to Jewish belief and so clear in all of our Jewish sources that we could never consider compromising on that basic idea. So I said the Bible, from the beginning, does not segregate the world into the holy and the unholy. But in many different parts of the Bible, certain sites are declared holy. Can you think of any? Certain places are declared holy in our story, in the story of the Jewish people. What about the burning bush? Remember when God says to Moses, take off your shoes. You're standing in a holy place. Why was that a holy place? And was it a holy place just then? Or would it always be a holy place forever and ever? What about Mount Sinai? Everyone had to stay away from the mountain, remember? Couldn't even come close. Was it because God's Spirit was resting on that mountain? Or is it because the mountain itself was holy? And of course, Solomon's temple, right? Sanctifying a particular place and a particular mountain. Was it because a temple would be built there? Was it because there would be sacrifices offered there? Or does that particular mountain have some holy status regardless of what takes place on it? Was it always special for God? And by the way, every time you visit the mountain, you'll always hear these stories of, oh, this mountain was holy way before the temple existed there. What are some of the myths about the holiness of the Temple Mount? You may have heard, from there God created the world. What is the rock underneath the shrine, the dome of the rock? In Hebrew, they call it Even Shetiyah, the rock of foundation. Oh, this is the rock from which God created the whole world. It all started there. This is the rock upon which Abraham sacrificed his son. Right? This is, what other stories have you heard about the rock? About that place? Every time there's a mountain of any importance that's unnamed, oh, it happened there. God designated that site as holy from way, way before. And our temple was built upon a site that was independently holy. Not that the site became holy because a temple was built there. And you see how it changes things? If the site was only made holy because of a temple that stood there, well, is it still holy today? But if it was previously a holy site, then it remains, obviously, even though there's no temple there today. The first three sources you have on your source sheet point to Solomon's sanctification of the temple. And I want us to pay close attention to certain words that are used when the temple was consecrated. The first source on the page is simple. Vayikadesh Shlomo etoch chatzer. Solomon consecrated the middle part of the courtyard in front of the temple of the Lord. When Solomon consecrated the temple, he wasn't consecrating the whole mountain. What was he consecrating? What does it say? Toch hechatzer. What do you think it is that he's consecrating? The inner courtyard of the temple where the sacrifices were offered by the priests. So Solomon's, in this source, consecration of the temple does not apply to the whole mountain. He's seemingly only consecrating a certain part of the temple where its most holy rituals will take place. Does that speak to a source? If I was going to ask you, is this a source that gives us evidence for the temple's eternal consecration? That it was when Solomon consecrated it, it was because the status of the mount itself is and will always be holy? Or is it a source that seems to suggest that it was only holy because of what was going on there? In other words, its status is dependent, not independent of the people using it. Where would you place this source? The former or the latter? I would put it in the latter. The language is he consecrated the middle part almost because that's where the burnt offerings and the bronze altar and the grain offerings were made. Since we're going to do all this stuff there, I better consecrate this land. And I could use the same language to say, well, if we're going to build another temple, it doesn't have to be on the Temple Mount. We'll build it in Tel Aviv, and I'll consecrate the land where the most holy activities will take place, and that will be holy. Source number 2. Do not be stiff-necked as your ancestors were. This is all from the second book of Chronicles. You won't This is the most boring book of the Bible. The Chronicles is a retelling of the story of the kings of Israel in particular, other stories, but mostly the kings of Israel. The original version, most people, when they're reading about the kings of Israel, will turn to the books of Samuel and Kings. But Chronicles retells the story and sometimes adds different information. Do not be stiff-necked as your ancestors were. Submit to the Lord. Come to his sanctuary. What does it say? Asher hikdish le'olam, which was consecrated forever. Now a new concept enters into our study, that when Solomon consecrated the temple, it was not, even though it was for the stuff that was going to occur there, it would be consecrated forever. We have the ability, according to this source, to designate a piece of land as eternally holy, independent of what we're actually doing there, right? And in the third source, the Lord appeared to him at night, that's Solomon, and said, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. So God appears to Solomon in verse 12 and says, I hear your prayer. I've chosen this place. Bacharti b'makom hazeh li. I have chosen this place for me, not for you. This is the place where I will be. Lebeit zavach. That place will be the house of sacrifices for me. If you want to sacrifice, you sacrifice there for me. Is that eternal or temporary? It's hard to tell to me. I don't know. You think it's eternal? For me, it's hard to tell. Because the first part, God saying, I chose this for me, seems eternal. But then when it says, but I'm doing so that I can have a house of sacrifice there, that suggests that if the house of sacrifice isn't there anymore, then God has no use for this place. You understand what I'm saying? Like, it's confusing to me. I don't think it's clear in that verse. Well, unless they were. So the comment is the sacrifices were not supposed to end. But how do you say that? And in the rabbinic mind view, everything is God's will, right? Maybe the sacrifices were not supposed to end, but in the rabbinic worldview, we were deserving of punishment. That's why the temple was destroyed. So God wanted the sacrifices to end.
He says the rabbis are right.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Maybe they're wrong. Verse 13, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. This is a bit different. Doesn't talk about any holy place in those verses, 13, 14, verses 13 or 14. It just says, wherever you are, if you're upset at the way things are going, pray and I will listen to you. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. But this place is special. This place is special. When you're praying, I'm paying special attention to the prayers that are coming from the temple. Why? I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. Oh, now we're moving into the eternal camp, right? God chose this place and consecrated the temple. Bacharti vehikdashti et habayit hazeh. I've chosen this place so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. Did God pick and choose the temple, or did he pick and choose the mountain? Ve'ata bacharti vehikdashti, what? Et habayit hazeh. I've chosen this home. Now, you could say that maybe God was talking about a home in the same way we speak of Toronto as our home. But it seems more likely to me that when God says, I've chosen this house, he's not talking about the city or about the mountain, but about the temple itself. Well, if there's no temple, then what is this place? Especially when God says, Lihiot Shemi Sham Ad Olam. My name will rest there forever. Confused yet? I am. How do you make sense of this? How is someone living in a post-destruction age supposed to make a determination about whether the Temple Mount status is permanent or temporary when there's a verse that says, my name is there forever? Right before or right after it says, in my house. And that house isn't there anymore. What happened to God's name? What happened to that place? So if you go and visit Jerusalem, you could see that there are people who really believe that God's presence is still there. If you go in those tunnels, the temple tunnel tour, take that tour of the temple tunnels, and you see there's a special part of the tour. Anyone here taken that tour before of the temple tunnels? So you know what I'm talking about when you get to this part in the tunnels where there's like a mark on the wall, and they say, this is the closest you can get to the Holy of Holies. And there's always some old lady there praying intensely, because it's natural that if you believe that God's name still abides there, if you're believing what you're reading, the Yot Sham Shmi Ad Olam, my name is there forever, that you want to get the closest you can. Right? But if you think about it, it's a bit silly to someone who says, but the temple's not there, you're praying to a wall. And God said, I chose that temple, not that mountain. Yes.
My house or my home?
Habayit hazeh.
My home?
This home.
Home. My house. This home.
I don't know. It's tough. It's a good question. Is it home or house? I'm not sure that the difference exists in Hebrew. Bayit is bayit, right? Home, house, same thing, right?
But the house is a structure and the home is.
House is a structure and a home is different. A home can be a place, but in Israel, the word bayit can be both, right? So, but I think I can't help you. I'm just going to leave you more confused. Bayit can be both things, which just leads to a vaguer a difference, right?
No, it's like, this is my home. Doesn't matter if there's a structure there.
Right. So if the Bible was written in English, we would have some hints here if the Bible used the word home or house. Bayit usually means house, right? Unless it means home. All we know is a place is chosen and sanctified. But it seems to be that it's a physical structure. I would put my money on that, not a mountain. How can a physical structure that has been destroyed carry God's name forever. So let's jump forward now to the rabbinic period. In the rabbinic period, you find evidence for both ideas. First, that the Temple Mount was sanctified eternally, and the other idea that sanctification can be temporary, doesn't have to be forever. Mishnah Megillah, this is one, let's go over slowly so everyone understands it. Rabbi Yehuda said further, we do not give a eulogy in a sanctuary that has been destroyed. Sanctuary, the Hebrew is Beit Knesset. So we're not talking here about a temple. But obviously, what applies to a synagogue, if we're going to be strict with a synagogue, we would be even stricter, right, with the temple. What does that mean? We don't give a eulogy in a sanctuary that's been destroyed. A eulogy in the rabbinic mindset is something good. I know that seems strange, but I've actually said this before before I begin funerals. Death is a tragedy, but to give a eulogy is something you do for a good person, right? To give a eulogy is to pay tribute to somebody. It's a privilege to give a eulogy. I'm not going to say it's a joyous occasion, but it means you're celebrating somebody's life. So to go to a place where once a sacred structure stood and to do something happy there would be disrespectful. So to spread out bundles or set up traps or spread out fruit on the roof to dry. What are all these things? They're ordinary. It's basically saying, I think, to treat this space like any other space, you should not do. Make it into a shortcut. Oh, let me just cut through the sanctuary to get to where I have to go. One is not permitted to do. As it says, I will destroy your sacred places. Their sanctity remains even after they are destroyed. The proof text here is from the 26th chapter of Vayikra. Vahashimoti et mikdashechem. I will destroy your sanctuaries. Remember, the Mishnah, to make a law, will often quote a biblical source. Here, that's what happens. The biblical source is, I will destroy your sanctuaries. How do we learn from that the place itself where the sanctuary once stood, the land, is still holy? How do we learn from that verse? Any ideas? This is how I read it. Rabbi Yehuda, this is all the comments of Rabbi Yehuda, right? Is saying, God will destroy sanctuaries from time to time, right? But God does not destroy the holiness that was embedded there. The word that is used in the Torah is mikdashechem, your holy building. Read it that way. I'll destroy your holy building. Not, I'll destroy your holy land or take away its holy status. If the point If God was going, let me put it this way. If God was going to destroy a synagogue, how could he call it a mikdash? Does that help to understand? Everyone's got to get this point or I'm not moving forward. The proof.
Why would he? Synagogue.
Because you deserve it. Why would God destroy a synagogue? Because the people deserve it. The Romans came and knocked it down. Listen, if I'm going to destroy something precious to Jewish people, what am I going to destroy? Either the kitchen or the Beit HaMikdash or a synagogue, right? It could be. We don't know exactly what we're referring to. It could be a hurricane because, maybe in the biblical mind, the forces of nature are punishing us. That's the same as God punishing us. But look at the language. That's what I want everybody to focus on. How is it that Rabbi Yehuda learns that the building is destroyed, but the place itself maintains its holy status? God would never destroy a holy thing, but God calls that place Mikdashechem, your holy places, even after they're being destroyed. That's Rabbi Yehuda's reading. I will destroy your holy places. If the holy status was going to be removed, God would have said, I'll destroy your synagogue. I'll destroy your buildings. But the word Mikdashechem, your holy places, implies for Rabbi Yehuda, it's still holy. And therefore, to cut across town by walking through the synagogue, I'll get to the market a little bit faster, you're stepping over a holy place. And you can't do that. By the way, that's a law in Judaism. You are not allowed to use the sanctuary as a shortcut to get from one place to another. And there's a synagogue here that's always a problem for this. You ever been to the Pride of Israel synagogue? The Pride of Israel is built messed up. To get from one side of the building to the other side of the building, you have to walk through the sanctuary. Ever been there? Think about it. To get from what the synagogue is divided in such a way where you have to walk through the shul to get from one side to the other side. So there's a rule when you're doing that, you have to stop in the sanctuary, say something from the Sidur. Most people will say, Matovu ahalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How beautiful are your sanctuaries, O Israel. And then you walk on your way. That's a rule. Otherwise, you're using a sanctuary as a shortcut. So this is the rule not only for sanctuaries that are still existing and still in use. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this is the rule for sanctuaries, and I'm not talking about Beit Mikdash, about the temple. I'm talking about synagogues that are destroyed. They are on holy land. Once it has been made holy, its holiness is forever. Some of you maybe have seen a groundbreaking for a synagogue before. A groundbreaking ceremony is not a crane putting bricks on the floor. Groundbreaking usually involves, for a synagogue or other religious structure, the presence of a rabbi who says something about, we now consecrate this place as a holy place. Well, what does that mean? Now that Shar Shalom, for instance, is being used for I don't know, an international school, yikes. Maybe we shouldn't have consecrated it. Maybe we should have said, this depends on there being people who want to use this place. Rabbi Yehuda would not be happy. You made this place holy. How can you now That was not temporary, that's forever. So this is a source that says there is such a concept in Judaism as sanctifying a place forever. Question.
Okay, so he says, I will destroy your sacred places.
Yes,
It doesn't just say, I will destroy my sacred places.
right. I will destroy your sacred places. Mikdashechem.
What you believe to be holy is necessarily right. I mean, like-
Interesting. You could read it that way. Maybe your holy place, but this was not holy to me. You- My holy place, the Temple Mount, or places where people behave properly.
Or, no, but I go back to.
Yeah.
I don't know, like this, because that was the person who read.
Yes.
But all these other places, you've made them holy, consecrated, and fine, but they're not my holy places, so.
It's an interesting read, but it's not how Rabbi Yehuda reads it, right? Right. But we have to understand how he reads this in order to come up with his justification. Since God says, I will destroy your holy places, in other words, imbuing that place with sanctity, even as it's being destroyed by using the word Kodesh, they're holy forever. Now you could say he's completely wrong. That's not what that verse means. Fair. Rabbinic learning is very frustrating because often the read of a verse will be completely wacko. I shouldn't say it. That's disrespectful. Often the reading of a verse will come out of left field and you'll be like, that's not what that verse means. But remember, we practice rabbinic Judaism. That means the Judaism that we have inherited is a Judaism that reads the Torah in a particular way, which could be very distant from what the original meaning was, but that is the way that's been accepted over time. This is how we read a verse. And you're not allowed to say, but we read it wrong. You can't say that. No, we read it in our way. That's our way of reading it. Other people read texts differently. Rabbi Yehuda read this text, meaning what was holy before it was destroyed is holy after it's destroyed. And the next source, yeah, Arlene?
I just wanted to ask you a question. In Israel, the holy sites
Yes.
where maybe the building has been destroyed, do they fence it off or do they?
The question is, are holy sites fenced off? Some yes, some no. It depends on the holy site. Maybe it should, but Rabbi Yehuda is one voice in the Mishnah. It's not necessarily the opinion that makes its way into Jewish law. We didn't get there yet. We didn't get to, okay, so how do we actually practice this today? Can a synagogue be decommissioned? Is there a decommissioning ceremony? Can the Temple Mount be decommissioned? Why? Why can't we decommission the Temple Mount? It should be entertained. If we commissioned it in the first place, then it was always Mikdashechem, your holy place. Well, if it's my holy place, then if I want to move it across the street, then I'm allowed to. I'll move it here to there. It would solve a lot of problems if we could move the Temple Mount to Tel Aviv, right? Solved. Not that simple. And just one more source that also, I would say, strengthens the idea that something can be made holy forever, even after its destruction. This is from the Midrash, Psikta Zutra. You see that on page 2? Just like Shabbat remains in force whether or not the temple exists, so too the Mikdash keeps its status whether or not the temple exists. Where is this from? There's a verse in the Torah, Et Shabtotai Tishmoru ve'et Mikdashi Tira'u. That's a verse in the book of Leviticus. Observe my Sabbaths and fear my sanctuaries. So the rabbis ask, what does Shabbat have to do with sanctuaries? That's Midrash always asks a question implicitly. You can't read the question, but you have to understand what the question that's being asked. So the question is, what does Shabbat have to do with the temple? The answer is, just like Shabbat was always meant to be observed regardless of circumstance. Shabbat is a permanent fixture in Jewish life. So is the temple, whether it's around or not. Right? And what's interesting is the comparison of the temple and Shabbat. What does Heschel call Shabbat? His famous book, The Sabbath. Heschel calls Shabbat the palace we build in time. And the sanctuary is the palace we build in space. In other words, you have these two models which represent sanctity for the Jews, one spiritual, one physical. The temple and the Sabbath, they are very much connected and related. So, one was meant to be an institution for all time. Well, obviously, if they were put together in the same verse, et Shabtotai Tishmoru vet Migdashi Tirau, then the other one too must be there forever. Think of the implication, therefore. We should treat the Temple Mount like the Sabbath. Meaning, maybe according to this midrash, we should be up there offering sacrifices right now. Right? It's ours. Temple Mount belongs to us. It was given as an institution for all time, not the temple. This source understands very clearly that the temple is destroyed. But the sanctity of that place doesn't come from the building. It comes from the ground, almost. And we should be up there doing the rituals and sacrifices that we're doing, that we were always doing when the temple was around. That make you uncomfortable? What kind of sacrifices? All of them. Animals. Right? We should be up there. I think focus less on the sacrifices and more on why are we not on the mountain? Why is it? So right now the status of the Temple Mount is, even though it's part of the state of Israel, it's Jordanians that have authority over what goes on the Temple Mount, right? And part of the deal that was made in the years following the 67 war, when the Temple Mount was captured, is that Jews won't go up there to pray. We'll stay away. Out of respect for the Muslim shrines that exist on the mountain, we won't go up there. But maybe Jewish law doesn't even permit us to take that approach. This is ours forever. When we have the ability to stop people from walking on holy land of ours, right? We can't discuss it if we don't have the ability to stop it. But today we do. And there are some who believe that's exactly what we should be doing. It's time to kick the Jordanians off of Jewish land and take control again of a place that was meant to be sanctified for us forever. Start World War III. Well, I say it facetiously, but that's why we're not up there, right? The fear following 67 was, if we do that, we will engage the Muslim world because it's a holy site to them, in a horrible, horrible catastrophe of a war. And we were not prepared to do that. But Israel today is different than in the 60s, right? Okay. Shall we stop there? I think so. So we have today the build-up, I hope, through this class. what we're getting towards. So far, it doesn't look very easy to suggest that we could compromise. Are you with me? Do you agree? Doesn't look very easy for us if we want to make the case that we're allowed to compromise on Jewish sovereignty over